Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Super excited to have you all join us today. My name is Bolaji Ayodeji. As always, your host for another community webinar. I'm super excited to have you all with us today. I can see we have a couple of folks here from Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Rwanda, Tanzania, the Gambia, Togo, Uganda, the United Kingdom, and so many other countries. So feel free to let us know where you're joining from. The live chat section is open already. And yes, today we do have a very special guest and a very special topic, by the way. And we'll be talking a lot about commercial open source and what that looks like and how you can take good advantage of that. And answering a couple of questions you may all have regarding all of that, licensing, how does this work, and everything that revolves around the business of open source itself. And yes, just in case you're joining us for the first time, this is Open Source Community Africa. It's a community of open source creators and contributors. Sorry about that. My mic disconnected. That's been happening the past few minutes. But anyways, I'm back now. So yeah. If this is the first time here, feel free to join the community at oscaafrica.org/discord. And we are currently running a survey to better understand our community and to, better understand the technical makeup of everyone so we can better improve our programs. I would also be bringing this up at the end of the stream, but please feel free to go through the survey and then fill that up as you can. And thank you very much. Our guest for today is Maxime. Maxime is a VC at Runa Capital, where he focuses on open source infrastructure, artificial intelligence, devtools, and all that. And before joining Runa Capital, he founded two companies, Dashblog, and that's a platform where you could make web automation smart and easy, and Simolia, a tech consulting firm. And we're super excited to have Maxime with us today. Hi, Max.
Hey, guys. Hey, Bolaji.
Yeah, how's it going?
Doing well, doing well. What about you?
Very well, thank you. We're super excited to have you with us today.
Thanks. Excited too.
All right, so we can get right into it. We would have the talk session for quite a minute and then we take some questions. I think we already have some questions beforehand. So if you do have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat section while Max goes on.
Cool. Let's go.
All right. I'll leave you to it now.
Cool. So really nice to meet you all, guys. So today we're going to talk about, investing in open source and especially commercial open source, which is a topic that I think used to be almost a polemic by itself, and today is more generally accepted, which is a good thing because, if you want to build something on the long term, and you do this through an organization, then you would need money for that organization survive, right, and be able to live. And so I think this is where commercial open source is really interesting when it comes to building open source stuff. So I think I've been quickly introduced, so might go really fast on this one. Maybe a couple of things interesting is that I've been a founder myself for 8 years, built two companies, went through, the cracks of, building startups and, just learning a lot by iterating, trial and failures and all those stuff. Until a point where I thought that it could be interesting to go on the other side of the table. First, to understand how investors think, how they approach companies, and also to, generally speaking, just improve the founder that is, at the moment sleeping in me, but still here. So yeah, maybe a quick word about Runa. We are a VC fund. We are more than 10 years old and made a couple of investments. So actually more than 100 startups in portfolio today. Tickets range in between few hundred thousand and few million. The sweet spot is around seed stage where we like to lead things. We do also invest in Series A, but let's say that the core focus is around seed, mostly in the US, but also in Europe. We did some investment here and there, for instance, Union 54 in Africa, but those are more, let's say, experiments related to our core focus, which is mostly on the US market. And I think on what we invest in, it's interesting to maybe highlight our focuses. So we are not truly generalistic. We have like 4 core focuses. First one is what I generally call tech for tech people. So, it goes with open source, developer tools, and also everything around infrastructure, software, infrastructure, AI. The second one is future of computing. So, you see companies in quantum computing, in photonics, and those, super geeky and passionate things. Third thematic is a bit larger, is enterprise AI. You can call it also vertical SaaS, but, those last years, I think a lot of folks have been trying to use AI to reinvent some industries or redefine them. And so it goes from, customer support to sales to data analysis, etc. And the last one is fintech infrastructure. So, also on the infrastructure level, but more focused on finance, and how do you bring like fintech capacities to your customers, like, opening bank account or issuing credit cards. And yeah, overall, more than $500 million invested, and keep going. And I think, yeah, that's a perfect transition about open source. So, in the first thematic, tech for tech people, we see a lot of open source companies. You have a few on this slide. 2 are just, ghosting the slide. They are here, but they are not announced yet. But yeah, maybe for the history, first investment in open source was in Nginx more than 10 years ago. First check in the company and, shared all the journey until their exit to F5 some years ago. Another very interesting case because went from, right at the beginning until also like meaningful outcome, which is MariaDB, so more on the database side of things. And then a bunch of startups that are still, growing. You might know some of them. Just quick mention, special mention for Pandas AI here, which is on the bottom right. They are on Product Hunt today, so make sure to just, share some love with them and then say hi. They are really, I think they are product of the day until now. So yeah. And so yeah, maybe before going into details on commercial open source, like it's always good to go back to the basics and think about why actually open source matters. And I think it's really interesting to remember. It's actually Red Hat founders that I took this from him. He had a talk on Open Core Summit last year, where he was reminding everybody that everything started with open source. And back in the 60s, when you would buy whatever computer, which are far from what we know, because today you have way more power in this than in this room full of different parts of what was then called the computer, right? The software component was free and open, and I think free is maybe not the most important here, but is also explaining why things closed at some point, because the idea came to distribute more binaries and not the whole software and the whole code, so that people would be dependent on the software provider for updates. And so this is where the software monetization and kind of software, the closed source were forked from the open source roots. Especially for monetization reasons. And yeah, maybe, I'm sure a lot of you are aware about this, but maybe, why is open source powerful? First, you have a lot of crowd and distributed approach and effort I think I really like this number that more than 300 million contributions were made on open source projects last year, and this comes from GitHub. And so it's not all, but it's most of it, right? So you of course have something that is powered by the community, in some extent, is way more transparent than closed source software. I'm telling in some extent because I think we could debate for hours about, what is called open source models, which might be less transparent than open source software. And you have somehow no commercial lock-in, in a sense that, if you pay for the software or if you pay for the managed version of the software, you are still free of stop paying and just going back to the community edition of the software, which might come with some pains. And this is why, and this is where also companies and organizations building open source systems can rely on monetizing, but you don't have a strong lock-in, which is if you want this, you need only to pay for it. And those three things, I think, in my opinion, are the core foundations of open source, and this is what makes it really powerful. Yeah, I think, in the continuity of, the power of open source comes also, the maintenance of it. I'm sure you are all familiar with this meme, right? But you can build a lot, and I think this is also what's happening today. We keep, going higher in the abstraction levels of what we are building. But all this relies on foundations. Most of those foundations are open source, and some of those might not be commercial, which is totally fine, right? That's also part of the essence of it, but sometimes it makes maintenance difficult. And I think this meme is hilarious, but it's also I think should push a lot of us to a deep reflection about, yes, you can finance open source startups as a VC, but maybe there is also long-term and other ways of, generally speaking, financing the open source ecosystem. Might be through sponsoring, might be through other solutions that have not been designed yet. But I think it's a really important question because, those Rondos in Nebraska or wherever else are still empowering a lot of software out there, and so we need to manage pushing those guys to keep maintaining what they built. And yeah, the impact of open source is truly global, especially on tech. I think this OSCA number is really telling it all, right? 98% of all code bases are using open source, and most of those code bases are actually open source. It's a bunch of layers just stack on each other or connected to each other, and a lot of those are just open source packages that in between which you would write custom code, on top of which or under, but most of the code bases today are using, again, extensively and relying extensively on open source. Why so? I think you have this, some reasons that comes from report from Red Hat. It can come from the software quality. It can come from the pace of innovation, the security, which is also, in some way true, but, also if you don't update your dependencies, you might be, facing vulnerabilities. And so it also introduce other challenges when you are using open source in production and at scale. And the ability to leverage new technologies. So now if we dig into our topic, which is commercial open source, I think before, entering in how to invest, or how at least we do invest in open source, I think it's always good to go back to the history. And then here, if you look back, before the 90s, it was almost gross to mix open source. Okay, I think there is some music that started. Anyway, if you go back in the 90s, it was almost gross to mix monetization and open source. And so I think this meme is just, you know, telling it all. And the first, I would say, generation of monetization around open source happened with something that has been hard to scale. And I think the only one organization that managed scaling it is truly Red Hat. To a certain extent, and was through support, right? So you would not necessarily monetize through a product, but mostly through the support that you would provide to the one using your repository at scale. And then I think through the year 2000 onward, we started to see kind of the productization of open source. The first ways of doing so was with OpenCore. So, you know, you have your repository, you can use it for free. If you want to use it on your premises and you want to have like what is called enterprise features, so always the same, right? It can be a role-based access control, it can be SSO, it can be audit trail. Then you would pay for those boring to be implemented features, but that are required for enterprise. And so this is a way to let the core of the software accessible for most of the developers for free, but then create some type of upgrade which is required by your organization when you would come and be like, you know, I've played with this repository for the last few weeks. We are thinking about, you know, changing this piece on the stack. Look, I think that's the best one. We should try it. And then you can have a small poke internally with or without the repo editor. And then at some point when you want to scale with it, then you would need those enterprise features to a certain extent of what the repo does and how pertinent it is. And then the new generation somehow of open source, I think came, sorry, if we can just go back to the slide. Yeah, thank you. Came from what happened with some repositories. So, you know, you have some cloud providers and hyperscalers that just started to distribute massively some repositories. And this is where also I think the license debate is really interesting. I think, in my opinion, and I might be biased, but I think most of the licenses are not put in place to limit the community, but more to limit the distributions by external companies that have like huge and almost like unfair distribution channels related to you. And so this is the SaaS version. You know, a lot of repo builders understood at some point that people were just, you know, managing the whole thing and distributing it and making revenues like this. And so they started to build their own managed version and distribute it. Maybe sometimes with less distribution power than those hyperscalers, but then slowly we are getting there and manage to bring the money back to the editors, right? And then there is all the partnerships and everything that is, you know, second, more, I would say, second term impact that once the guys started to distribute by themselves, then they found like partnership agreement with those very large hyperscalers, etc. I think, you know, the main conclusion and the most important thing here is that across all those different ways of monetizing, the rule of thumb is that the core of your software, if you want to build a community around it, the core of the software, which is, you know, the most important thing, should be what's open source. Because this is what will bring value to your community. This is where they will get started. And this is what will create this customer, or at least user journey, in which at some point, some of those might want to become customer to access more features, more disponibility, more availability, more support. Because, you know, you have different ways of monetizing, but this is where you should get started. And so, yeah, this slide is like slowly provocative. But, you know, if you look at companies like Mongo, for instance, where is the difference, right, between a classic closed source SaaS and like if you take Atlas, like it's just exactly the same. You have this little devil, which is like start for free, but from the moment you click, you know that if you like it, you'll end up paying. You have just a classic SaaS, and there is, you know, the most afraiding things of all, which is like if you are a large organization, then just talk to us. And so you know that your pricing will be related to your size and the value it brings, not to anything rational. And yeah, I think we don't need to enter in long debates here, but I think one case study which is actually interesting is the database industry, where you can see that from the last let's say 10 years onward, open source literally beat the whole closed source part of the industry, and it keeps going, like with new actors that are not here on the slide, but you can think about a bunch of them, right? Like working on managed versions of Postgre, but with like a open source repo around it. And so I think databases, being classic databases or vector databases, or you name it, keeps being a really interesting case study. And interestingly enough, there is some industries that are more prone to be disrupted by open source. It might be because those industries are deeply familiar with developers, and generally, the first thing you would do when you need to build something is check if something exists on the open source side, and especially on GitHub today. But not only that, I think open source has a lot of virtues that can be brought to other industries, and I think we will discuss briefly about it in some slides. And so maybe the last interesting factor is like, why does it make sense now? And why apparently it's easier to build. I don't know if it's easier to build, but why it's easier to get investment as an open source founder today if you build especially on a commercial product. Then I think it relies on 4 key reasons. If you look with developers, and let's say like the demand side, we have like way more developers than we ever had today, and I think they are way more valued than ever. On enterprise side, I think the virtues of open source are recognized, and I think you have also like a lot of industries that are going more or less or more heavily regulated, which goes in favor of open source, and especially of open core monetization model for some, at least for some of the repositories. On government side, there is a need for transparency. There is more and more regulation, which are the one I just mentioned for enterprises. And there is I think more importance is given on sovereignty. And so generally open source helps with that. On VC side, maybe last but not least, because they are the one bringing the money, right? I think the last 20 years saw a lot of open source companies, and especially commercial open source companies, rise and succeed. And so I think people got also more familiar with the business model and with the virtues of open source for a startup. Even though you might still face, investors, let's say, not that much educated about the topic, and being really surprised that someone can use your product forever without ever paying. But I think it just goes, slowly, like people get more educated and aware of, the strengths. This is just, what anyone educated or not would find on writing, like on just Googling open source success or whatever. I call those guys the 7 dwarfs. Those are the largest open source companies today. Together, they are worth more than 100 billion valuation. And I think those are, interesting examples for investors to have kind of, back tested and proved examples that you are not just getting crazy with your idea of backing this company doing something that was done closed source until now in an open source manner. Those guys did it before in industries that were apparently in the same situation than this new one, and it worked for them. So it can work for you, and especially for the founders. And yeah, I think everybody loves open source today. I mean, if you can see slide. everybody loves open source. No, yeah, and so I think, you know, you see Microsoft evolution on open source is like proof of the fact that the model is way more accepted today, and yeah, just celebrated, generally speaking. So this is more, you know, entering into details of what we do check, at least at first sight, when we are talking with open source companies in order to invest. I think the first thing is really important, and is important to keep in mind, is that the fundamentals keeps and remains being the same. So, you know, generally you would look at the strength of the team, what those guys or girls did before, what's their track record, how do you believe that they are able to build a very large company? Because, you know, that's at the end of the game, the day, that's the VC game, right? Like you invest early or less early, but you want this company to become like very large and successful. What's the product? And what's the vision for it? The earlier you are, the more aware you should be that this might change a bit or radically over time. You know, like the companies get started, pivot, and you know, that's the life cycle of things. But I think it's always important to, you know, have a product and also like a longer term vision of what could happen if everything goes well. What's the go-to-market here? So, you know, like, of course, if you do open source, it's hard to go top down. You would generally like create some like bottom-up motion, but how do you do this, right? So that's an important one. The ambition, I think, goes with, you know, the team strength and how large this can be. What's the market? This is a really important one. And why, you know, could you, in which extent could you like get a meaningful piece of this market? And to get a piece of this market, generally you would need to differentiate from what exists, and how do you do so? And so this is where open source can be very powerful, not by just being an open source version of X, but by using, you know, virtues of open source to as almost unfair advantage to differentiate yourself from existing products. And of course, the ambition goes with, you know, the team strength and how big this can be. And so, yeah, in our case, we have been approaching open source investments in two different ways. I think, you know, I remember when I went through Y Combinator the first day, we were sat, it was just batch kickoff, and they asked everybody, like, what's your North Star metric, you know, and everybody went with its own current North Star metrics, which was like, I don't know, weekly active users. No, for me, it's like, I don't know, session time on the tooling. No, for me, it's like a number of sign up to first action conversion, etc., etc. But nobody mentioned revenues. And so it was really hilarious that, you know, we were apparently in the best accelerator in the world, right? Like, I truly believe that YC is the best thing you can do when you start an early stage, when you start a startup. But, you know, we just got this strong feedback that was like, guys, you all get it wrong. The most important thing is to make money, because you're not here, you know, if you want your company to survive, you need to make money, and you need to make more money than you spend. And we believe that you are all already spending money. So it's time to make money. This is true for all types of companies, but I would say that open source might, for some reason, and especially for adoption reasons, come with like slight exceptions on this. Sometimes you might differ a bit monetization. If you can monetize straight from the beginning, just go for it. But if you truly believe and there is like good rationale behind creating strong adoption before monetizing, and you do have a plan and you think that this plan is rock solid, then it might make sense to create adoption and focus on, product development and adoption in the first time, and then monetization. And so for those reasons, we approach deals in two ways. It can go from traction to thesis. This is what happened with Pandas AI, who once again is launching on Product Hunt today. So please, guys, go and share some love there. I remember the first time I talked to Gabriele, the founder. He was in his bedroom and literally was not understanding what happened. He just released, the repositories a few days ago, and just things got really crazy. And so from traction, we understood what they are doing. And so from, understanding the market behind and the opportunity in creating, open source data analysis tooling for enterprise using GenAI, then we get really sensible and attracted by the opportunity. Another way sorry, if we can just go back. The second way to go is from thesis to traction. So this is a company that is still not an investment that is not announced. The company is announced, but quite discreet at the moment. It's an open source CRM, and so something that made this investment happen is that before talking with those guys, I've been looking at the ways you can use open source, not for the tech stack, but maybe for what I call the business infrastructure. So you can think about sales infrastructure, which is the CRM, right? Operation infrastructure, which is the ERP, marketing infrastructure, etc., etc. And so I think the best example here of open source success is Odoo. If you are not aware of this, it's an open source ERP which has been built out of Belgium. I think it's a 20 years old company. Amazing success in terms of traction, but also in terms of monetization and scaling a company. And so it was obvious that the reason that could make open source an unfair advantage for an ERP were the same for a CRM. And so ended up looking on the topic and finding the right team and building the thing in a way that we believe that was let's say a good analogy with what carried Odoo from project to like successful companies, and this is how we invested in this other company. Going very quick on that one, but why GitHub data matters. I'm sorry if you hear some background noise, it's my kids playing just on the side. I think a lot of people would just look at stars. It's a good start, but it doesn't make everything, right? I think start is a good vector to get an idea of the visibility of the project, because it's not doesn't mean that anyone would use it or whatever. It means that someone wants to remember about this project, and so someone saw this project at first before starting it, and so it's just for me, it's just a vector to get an idea how visible is this thing. And then you have like the contributions. You also have the dependencies, but I'm going to talk about it just in a bit. But I think contributions are a good vector to access how qualitative is this thing, right? You can also check the code base if you know how to code, and you can of course read it, go through it and play with it, etc. But I think the more contributors you get, generally speaking, the more inspiring I would say your code base is, into a certain extent that some of the people that will check it will be like, you know what, there is this issue open, or I played with it, I opened this issue, but you know what, it's cool, code is well written, I'm gonna just ship it and solve it. And so I think it's a really interesting vector to understand how qualitative is this and how attractive and exciting it is for the one who are just ending up on this repository. Yeah, maybe two things that you can do with GitHub data. The first one is gauging traction, which is just what I mentioned about stars. I think absolute numbers like total stars is interesting, but you have repositories with 20,000 stars, but did not get a new star for the last 2 years. And so it means that maybe in terms of product cycle and project development, it might have been attractive some time ago, but it's maybe less now. So it's always really interesting to look at relative numbers, like for instance, monthly staff growth. Like if your monthly staff growth is just increasing, at the same time that your absolute numbers are increasing too, then your traction is just getting stronger and stronger. Or the inverse, which is generally less exciting in terms of traction. You can compare with similar projects. You can, correlate some bumps, like Hacker News show HN generally like generates a bump in terms of stars. So, if that's just, a one step bump and that's it and it's flat, then you can maybe, understand that the visibility was just related to this isolated event, which was the show HN. And then, there is no more visibility around it. And yeah, of course, HN is your best friend. I think, the dependencies obviously are more interesting to analyze than, the star numbers, because dependencies are, in fact, people, using it. And then, so obviously it's more meaningful. And yeah, if you go on the community, of course, you would want to split who is like a real contributor or who is like a long time friend who is just giving a hand on some issues. Of course, location and potential company behind each contributor is important, because there is projects with hundreds of contributors. Most of them are like very junior people trying to learn things, which is not bad per se, right? But just is a different motion or dynamic than, if your contributor are actually your customers that are shipping features because they need it, and then you would co-build those features with them and then ship it for them. So those are different dynamics. And of course, the volume, the quality. A lot of contributors are just sometimes, fixing a typo in the documentation or in the README, which is of course less meaningful than just, shipping a full feature. Of course, hanging on Discord and Slack, checking what people are talking about and doing, and just, entering the vibe and being like talking with people and understanding what they like, what they don't like, what excites them is I think really important to understand, what's engaging here. Yeah, maybe it's one of the last slides, and so it's important to, if you build an open source company, I think reflect a lot about why open source would be an unfair advantage. I really love open source. I most exclusively invested in open source companies until now. I'm not sure I will be able to say the same in 10 years if I still do this job. But I think it's an exceptional way of building things if you also understand what it can bring to your project and to your product, right? And so sometimes the way of getting an unfair advantage related to your competitors is through your community. You would build a really solid and community that is like empowering you to build integrations, for instance. If all your competitors have to build in-house a plethora of integrations, and you have an active and engaged community building those integrations, and what you need to do is just validate those integrations, check that it's well built, validate this integration, and ship it in prod. It's like an unfair advantage related to companies who should hire people to do this internally. I think in regulated industries, it's somehow a less common business model today, but open core is a really strong differentiator when you build software that brings value to large enterprise, and especially in regulated industries, because those guys prefer to self-host everything for regulatory reasons, especially if you deal, if you are the closest from the customer, the higher the requirement of on-premises deployment would be. The target user and being aware of the difference between your target user and your target buyer, which sometimes are two different people, but you will need to adapt your pitch to those two, because the one who's paying is not necessarily the one who is using, but you need to convince both, right? Security, the traction, etc. Like we could go for potential advantage of using open source in a commercial product for hours. I think at the end of the day, if you are building something in this area, the most important is for you to try to imagine what you can do, which is like rewarding for the community and also bringing value to your project first and also your product. So yeah, this is really quick. 3 slides about us and cool stuff we do related to open source. So we have this repo about awesome alternatives, open source alternatives to closed source tools. So if you are building in open source, please open a PR, just push your tool, put who you are, trying to disrupt, like closed source alternative, and we're happy to just showcase your tool there. Another cool thing we do is that every quarter we publish the 20 fastest growing open source startup. So this is based on GitHub data and repository, especially repository data. It's purely based on staff growth. It's I hear a lot of debate and I'm talking with a bunch of people about why it's good and why it's really limited also to classify or qualify fast-growing open source companies based on staff growth. But I think it's the right compromise in terms of metrics that we found to have like a publicly shared index and also that brings some value and meaning, right? And last but not least, we do some open source beers every month or 2 months. We did in Paris, we did in London, we did in Sweden, we'll do in San Francisco next week. I think New York by end of year, and hopefully we're going to Africa at some point, maybe Nigeria. That's it. And yeah, so I think that's it for me here. Just, once again, we do love open source. There is ways we are reading it. We might do things well, we might improve things over time. So super happy to hear your thoughts and discuss. Maybe there is some topics that, we can avoid digging too deep into, like for instance, licensing, because I think those are topics we could share literally the whole night discussing upon, right? But yeah, happy to just answer any question.
Thank you so much, Max. And definitely, once we get into the licensing conversations, we will definitely spend a lot of time here. And yeah, I'm sure everyone has learned quite a lot on what this process looks like. And if you do have questions, as I mentioned earlier, please feel free to share them in the chat. I think we have a couple of questions which we would start from, and then we would wrap up. Okay, so let me quickly. So first question on my list was, what are some security concerns that engineers should look out for when making an open source project?
You mean security in terms of the code you are shipping for your report, the potential vulnerabilities that you can include to your customers?
I think most likely the second.
Okay. So I think first, to start with, I think most of the serious software developers today are aware that using open source comes with a risk of introducing vulnerabilities. Yet everybody keeps using open source packages, right? So I think it's something that is happening. There is a lot of tooling around this. I think Snyk became very big. They are not open source, but they became very large for offering SCA products and other ways of understanding the vulnerabilities coming from your dependencies. But yeah, I think just the most important thing is that if you think you are introducing any potential vulnerability, just patch it as fast as possible. And then it's up to your users or customers to update, to update the dependency. But yeah, I think those things happen.
All right, Max. Second question is definitely one that we'll try to just talk quite short and then try to have the conversation async because it could get very lengthy. But it's more so how can open source creators prevent copyright and trademark issues with your experience having invested in this space? I mean, currently we have the WordPress and WP engine going on. In previous time, we've had Elasticsearch and Amazon, and these issues keep coming up over and over again. And I think it's one of the struggles many open source creators have, in the sense where we put these things out and we adopt the four freedoms of open source and everything is there, and yeah, we will still want to ensure that it's very sustainable. And then once the corporate giants come in, it gets messy once it goes there. So with your experience having been on the VC side, what do you think?
So I might have maybe contrarian approach here, but I think it's a good problem to have. If this ends up happening to you, it means that you are already successful. And so you are not an early stage startup, you made it. And then this is not the best. Ideally, you would avoid it. But it's a good thing because it means that you are already successful, right? So at the beginning, I would not bother with that. Just go, I think most of companies today are using AGPL v3. Just, go with the flow, build it, create adoption, make your first revenue, keep growing. And then when you will have, serious amount of money in bank, you can talk to really specialist people about this. Like, how do you, correlate your license and your brand and everything to make it as hard to be hacked as possible, because somehow it's a hack, right? And then keep most of your revenue for you and not for other people just distributing your solution. But I think don't break your head with this at the beginning. Just get started, create adoption, build, product and something that people want, generally speaking. And then down the road, you'll see. And you can prevent this later on, but very early, don't break your head with that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Max. And I mean, Max mentioned something about the AGPA license, just in case you don't know. Generally, we have two categories of licenses: permissive licenses and copyleft. And permissive basically just means, as it sounds, there's little restriction on how you can use and reshare the software. What that looks like is, when you reuse, you can, make additions to it without any obligations to, for example, share those updates. While copyleft licenses, anyone who releases a modified version, you need to release it with the same license. So AGPL, for example, is like a copyleft license. MIT, Apache, those are permissive licenses. And I think it's very important that you, as Max has said, you want to focus on building traction early and trying to get this out, and then figuring out the right license. It's very important, especially based on the type of project you're building. One tool that I know we usually use very often is the chooselicense.com, and try to use that to figure out the best path for you. And
maybe
I have
on that one, actually, just a point, an interesting point. I have seen some interesting things happening. It's not mainstream, but some companies are maybe more free and decomplexed to use MIT license in some case. And one of the common case I saw recently is that you would almost intentionally use an MIT license to build a proper competitor to a closed source, alternative that people could use as they want for free, and you would monetize on top of it with AI tailored for this need. So this is happening, for instance, in observability, where you have a lot of large companies getting bugged by alerts because they have different toolings on different parts of the stack, and the tech stack became so large and the company became so large that they have doublons or triplons in terms of systems observing their own system. And when something breaks, they have thousands of alerts. And so there is people building for it's not for free, but without that much protection with MIT license, pure alternative to closed source competitor, and then selling on top of it like AI layer to automate the classification and the aggregation of alerts. And I think I see this model slowly appearing of building like pure open alternative to closed source competitor and monetize like an AI based layer on top of it, which allows you to take market share quickly because you are like permissive and open alternative, and then you can do it way better using AI. So you would monetize through it, which is closed source, and just lay on top of it.
Yeah, this sounds quite interesting. I think it aligns very well with what you said earlier about figuring out what your market looks like and what do you want to do in that market. And there's so many kind of projects you might want to build, and there's so many directions you could go. It could be what you just shared, just a layer over something. You could be building something else. You could be building a digital public good or anything in that sense, and then find your market and then maximize it. I recently found this COSS commercial open source playbook. It's actually an excerpt from an actual book. I think I'll just just read out a couple of things there, which is very, very important when you're trying to figure out like your commercial open source business, because these are also the key things, as Max mentioned, that VCs look out for. First you want to create an entity, decide where that will be located, how that will be structured, and a bunch of all that stuff. Figure out your product, like Max mentioned. What's the market going to look like? How do you want to tell the world about this project itself? All bunch of branding stuff. You need to work on your documentation and then figure out how that part will look like, and then figure out your business model. It's usually nice if you have that, at least like Max mentioned. You just want to have an idea of what you're doing. Sometimes you might want to start, gain traction first before introducing like some selling points, or you want to start with some pricing before that. It works basically in multiple ways, and there are different business models. I think there's this repository that has different open source models, which would link that you can also take a look at. And next thing you also want to do is like know your community, as Max mentioned, know your customers, your market, know your competitive landscape. I mean, it's pretty much as though this is like a summary of all that Max just shared. Then pick your open source license, and then trademarks. As you begin to grow, you want to figure out all of those parts. Then there's like the contributors, CLAs, your code of conduct, and a bunch of all that stuff that structures the open source project itself. It's because it's open source doesn't mean it has to be less structured and less solid like every other startup, which means you have to put in the work to actually structure it very well, both so you can sustain it and also so you can provide value to those you're building the projects for. So I think this is very, very helpful. And there are a bunch of other stuff like in this playbook, like governance, license, FAQs, due diligence and copyrights, sponsorships, partnership, and a bunch of all that stuff. I would highly recommend you take a look at this playbook.
I think you mentioned two super important points, right? Like generally speaking, if you address developers, like documentation is like just nail it. That's where everything starts, right? And the second thing is that I think try to make it as easy as possible for people who wants to contribute to get started. And of course, you can do some contribute file where people can see where to start and so on, but you can also put some good first issues to start with, and when you do your triage on issues, like the easy one where you don't need to dig deep into the code base to understand everything, can be some light front end stuff or whatever. I think it's a good thing that we see more and more, and that encourage people to just actually jump and get started contributing, right?
Yeah, totally agree with you, Max. And yeah, I think I have some light questions. By the way, if you do have any other extra questions, the comment section is still open. Feel free to share them. I know some other persons would also be watching this live stream afterwards. It will be recorded. So feel free to still put your questions. We can pass them across to Max and then provide answers to you on Discord. So Max, a fun question. I think you touched point on this a bit. How did you become a VC?
Oh, that's a funny story. My last company, we wanted to build a Zapier, but for developers. And actually, I think I became obsessed by open source from our failure to open source our product. So, from the beginning, we were like, okay, let's build this thing open source. And then we were like, there is so much things to do. We were just two of us back then. And we were like, okay, let's just ship and we see later, right? And then we hired 1%, 2%, 3%, start, having like more strong ties with database, like with deployment stuff, your infra gets more complex and everything. People ask you stuff that, make things way harder to just open source. And then at some point you have this, huge internal mess. And it's like, okay, guys, we still want to be open source, but how the F do we do that? Like it's like 6 months to literally rewrite everything and split stuff. And so we ended up not being, right? And what we were doing, so we wanted to be your gateway to integrations. I think one doing this very successfully is merge.dev. And so we ended up going also into digging a rabbit hole, which was scraping, because a bunch of customers were like, we love those APIs, but there is this website. It doesn't have APIs, but I would like to get data or to automate flows there. So we ended up building this browser where we rewrite classification machine learning models to like automate web scraping and make it resilient to website updates. Long story short, I think, my last company was about data integration and scraping. And so when it came to, look for the next challenge on my next gig, I talked to a bunch of people because I did not really know what I wanted to do next. And I ended up talking with this fund that was like, we would like to be strongly data driven. And, we believe there is something we could build. We think we should get that data from the web and enrich it with APIs or third-party provider, but we don't really know, where to get started, how to do. Do you think you could do this for us, And so I started to build this thing. And so we ended up, scraping like, LinkedIn and other networks, like incubators, competing VC websites, enriching with like different databases, and try to predict who would build the company next, or which company would raise money in the next 3 months, 6 months. And so at some point I was, just right in front of my screen, be like, what are the triggering events? I have no idea, what's the triggering event from external data that the company will raise a seed or a Series A. So I just started to, gather data and try to find pattern and talk to companies. And at some point, from company to company, I ended up talking to companies that were actually raising and understanding that, maybe those are the interesting metrics. And I really enjoyed also talking to those companies and those founders. And so when this thing started to work, I was like, you know what? Maybe it's not that bad of an idea to try to be a VC for some time. And then, this is when I joined Runa, because we had really good discussion when I was building back in the days. And I really like the job. I think there is a bunch of ways of doing this job. I think you need people maybe more on the financial side of things, or, with a more pure business driven analysis of companies. And I think you need people that are somehow more artistic in their approach, which is, I think, maybe more my style because of the past. Right? Like, I think when you build a company, you would not necessarily look at pure metrics. It's also like, who are you, bro? What are you doing? Where do you want to go? And I think those things are really important, because at the end of the day, it's your baby, right? And so you went to those cracks, and then you want to try to build an opinion if this person in front of you can do it. That's my story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Max. And I know you have to run, so I'll just skip through a couple of questions and then move to last 2 questions. One, what's one fun fact about you? There has to be one, Max. You're live on stage. You need to be fun.
A fun fact about me. Name it. I think the first car I bought, I, did not have enough money to buy this car. And so the guy who was selling was like, do you have a car to give me in exchange, right? And I was like, I don't have any. That's why I'm buying one, right? And he was like, yeah, but can you, even if you can find one around you, that's fine, you know? And so I was like, okay. And so I talked to my dad, and my dad was like, yeah, I might have one, but it's like 20 years old, you know, destroyed Mercedes back in the backyard of someone there. You can take it, you know, but I don't think it even rolls, you know. And I was like, fine, you know, I went to see the guy. I was like, yeah, I have a Mercedes. And he was like, oh, yeah, Mercedes, that's good. Like, I can take this car. I can make you a good discount, you know. And so we signed the papers. And long story short, I delivered this car. I had to rent a truck to put literally the car on the truck because it could not go anywhere. It was not even proper wheels anymore. And so you should have seen the face of the seller when I bring this car to the garage. And look, he told me, like, I will always remember, because the car was not going down from the truck. And so we had to attach the car to the building and go with the truck so that this car falls down. And the guy literally told me, Mr. Corbani, it's the last time I do business with you. and I told him, I hope it's the last time I'm broke, because if I would not be broke, I would not buy this brand. Yeah, that's one of actually, I think, my best hacks.
That's actually quite funny. I can imagine how shocked the dealer must have felt in the car. Now I want to actually see what that.
He texted me, I think, a few weeks after, like, you know, telling me bad words that nobody wants to take this car, even to just, you know, for parts and stuff. And I was like, bro, like, you know, I give you all the data. You knew it before.
I mean, like, exactly. In your defense, it said any car around, so that flies.
I think the guy just kept Mercedes in mind, you know, did not listen the rest of the
story. Yeah, true. That's very interesting. Anyways, Max, last question. What advice would you give to developers looking to create their first open source project?
I think the biggest mistake we did is try to brute force our way in my last company, and I think we lost a lot of time because of this. If you don't do it again, try to just talk to people experiencing the pain that you are thinking about solving, and you will be really surprised first how people you don't know would just give you half an hour to talk about, you know, their experience with the pain you are trying to solve. And you will learn a lot. So just, you know, start by talking to people that experience what you try to solve. You might have your own experience, which is always a very good start, but try to talk to a bunch of people. And once those people are open to share their experience, try to understand, if you solve this thing, would they be ready to pay or to contribute in any way, right? Because telling that, yeah, that's awesome, doesn't cost anything, right? And being like, yeah, but if I do this, would you pay for it? Then generally people would be a bit more mindful about their answer, because they will think like, damn, this guy might come back in a few weeks, be like, I built it, do you want to pay for it now? You know, so don't be shy. I think ask those people about those things. I think, generally speaking, we engineers, we are not in our comfort zone doing this. And so we would always be like, you know what, let me just build this feature. And then once I build this feature, I'll go to talk to people. And then, of course, you ship the feature and you're like, yeah, but now, you know, this other one is not that good as it used to be. So I'll just patch this, and then I will. And you just keep pushing, postponing it, because you need to go out of your comfort zone, basically, which is building, and which is great, you know. But unfortunately, it's not always that. It's rarely the best product to win. It's the one that are the best sold. And so you need to, for that, you need to understand, you know, what people suffer from, what they want. Eventually, at some point, you need to build it, right? But you need to sell it also. And so don't be shy. Talk to people. Go deep in understanding what they want, and try to include them as you build it, and you know, at least make them adopt at first sight and at first time, and then maybe slightly understanding for what and why they would pay, and converge to monetization. Because being with VC or without VC, if you want to build a long-term company, you need money, because you won't be able to not pay yourself forever, right? Or if you are able to do this, that's great. You know, like, it's really cool for you because it means you're already rich, but, you know.
All right. Thank you very much, Max. It was really nice having you and learning more about commercial open source and how Runa Capital, does investments. And to everyone watching, if you want to, learn more about Max, you could check out the website. Max has this very interesting blog post I like about the rise of open source startups in France, which is what we also look forward to seeing more of that in the African region. So if you're building something interesting that you think Max would, want to look at, feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, please reach out.
With we've put the Discord channel multiple times. You could take a look at that. Let us know what you're building. If you think you're ready to scale your project and trying to, take it much more bigger, you can reach out. We can help you with that process and then see how we can help you structure things before you get to see Max. So you don't go to Max and Max says, ah. But anyways, and if you'd like to learn more about Runa Capital, you could check out runacap.com to see a couple of cool stuff they've been doing. And once again, thank you so much, Max, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and hope to talk to you all soon.
All right. So we'll be wrapping up shortly. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, help us improve the OSCA community and our programs. Please take our community survey. The link is up on your screen. It wouldn't take more than 5 minutes of your time. And we look forward to having you at our next webinar. As always, if you do have extra questions, you can reach out to us on Discord or put it on the chat. I would be looking at those often, and I will also direct those that need to go to Max. So thank you very much once again, everyone, for joining, and do enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you'll be watching this. Bye, everyone.